invited a resource person who is known to always see the positive and the good in every situation. It would be an injustice to give him a long introduction because there is hardly any Filipino who hasn't heard of him. Ladies and gentlemen, let me call on Dr. Bernardo Villegas, Pre-eminent economist, professor at Harvard University and the Instituto Estudios Superiores de la Empresa or IESE, and a member of the 1986 Constitutional Commission and patriot. Audience, while Dr. Villegas is talking, you may type in your questions in the chat box and he will try to answer them. Let's hear from you, Dr. Villegas.
Yes. Happy first anniversary to all of you involved with Iskaparate.com. You know, I was already suggested by Mayan Ignacio. Probably yung mga Katoliko sa atin, alam natin na today is the birthday of the Super Nanay, Mama Mary. And I think for those of us who believe in prayers, we should really pray to her to help us overcome all the difficulties that we're encountering because of this pandemic. But we know that prayers will only be effective if we put all the human effort we're capable of. And one of that is to make sure that we run our respective businesses, no matter how small, as competently and professionally as possible. And I'm sure that is what you appreciate Iskaparate.com is doing to assist you. I'd like to help you do one very important thing that business people should be doing, which is to look ahead and face whatever risks, dangers there may be in the future, as well as the opportunities that you can take advantage of. And my presentation will be both light and shadow. You know, I'm known to be always optimistic. However, I must be realistic about the next 6 to 12 months. Unfortunately, we are still going to struggle against lockdowns, MECQ. We haven't seen the worst of the virus. Delta is just one of them. We may have another more dangerous virus that will come. I don't want to frighten you, but let's be prepared. You know, in the same way that yesterday there were a lot of announcements about all of us being prepared for Typhoon Jolina. Fortunately, now in Manila, we still haven't been hit. I know in Batangas, tinamaan na sila. Now, let me tell you about the problems that we still have to face in the next 6 to 12 months. You know, yung third quarter natin, where we have so many lockdowns, not only in NCR, but in Davao, in Iloilo, in Cebu, and so on and so forth, babaksak na naman ang ekonomiya. Yung tinatawag na GDP, it will again decline. The only hope we have for this year is from probably November to December. When whatever happens, we Filipinos will want to celebrate Christmas. And we will spend a lot. And where will the money come from? Fortunately, the more than 10 million Filipinos abroad have been sending still $34 billion worth of remittances. Alam ba niyo na last year, when bumagsak ang ating ekonomiya by 9.1%, the biggest in recent memory, yung mga remittances declined only minus 0.3%. Practically, it did not decline. And yung first 6 months of this year, nag-increase na ng 6% yung mga remittances. These are our real heroes. And that is why especially towards the end of the year, they become more generous, we will have a lot of spending. Kaya ihanda na ninyo ang inyong mga produkto, especially anything to do with food. I'm so glad to know that the majority of you are in food, because the sector that is going to recover very fast is what is known as food and agribusiness. Yung food and agribusiness, hindi lang yung farming. Nabanggit ni Joey yung may ani. So that's another application that's helping farmers to get the best prices for their products through the internet, through all the digital technology that they have. But remember, agribusiness, practically all of you in food are in agribusiness. And even those of you who deliver, that's part of agribusiness. Agribusiness is farming, post-harvest, cold storage, logistics, processing, which many of you are doing, retailing, and that is going to recover more quickly than the others. It's a no-brainer. Food is the #1 requirement of any family, rich or poor. Of course, for the poor, the percentage spent on food is much higher, anywhere from 40 to 50%. While for the rich, it can only be anywhere from 10 to 15%. But food is always the first to recover. Then anything to do with basic commodities, anything to do with clothing, anything to do with housing, repairs, improvements, and so on and so forth. Furniture, yun ang mga produkto na madalis mag-recover. But the full recovery will come only in the second semester of next year. Between now and the first semester of 2022, marami pa tayong obstacles because it will take a long time for us to reach herd immunity. I'm sad to say that we mismanaged very badly our response to COVID-19. I don't want to dwell into all this scandal, all the money that has been stolen and so on and so forth. But even the delays, even the very slow rollout of the vaccine, we really stick out like a sore thumb, especially compared to some of our neighbors. And that is why I'm not optimistic in the short run. Pero pagdating ng second semester of 2022, our economy will begin to grow once again at the rate at which it was growing before the pandemic. 6%, and as we move towards 2025, 2028, that growth will accelerate to 7 to 8% because of our very strong fundamentals that have not been erased by the pandemic. And that is what I'd like to show you with data. I don't expect you to believe in me just because I'm the one saying it. I want to make sure that we have evidence. And the evidence is coming not from Philippine institutions, self-serving propaganda of our government, or even from private research groups here. All of these things I'm going to tell you are coming from think tanks, financial institutions, World Bank, ADB, that say many good things about us because they see that we have a strong foundation of the economy that we have built over a period of 20 years. It was a slow and painful process, but we are getting there. So let me first give you our first fundamental. Please, the first slide. The first one is what we can call our geographic dividend. We are right in the epicenter of the most dynamic economic region today. Countries in the so-called Asian century, if you take a look at the right graph. I'm sure some of you have heard that the last century, the 20th century, was called the American century. Without doubt, ang pinakamagaling na economy during the last century was the US. In fact, Europe and Japan tried to compete. They never were able to dethrone the US. But take a look at the bottom table. Before the pandemic, these countries of the American century were struggling to grow at 0.8 for Japan, 1.8 for the Eurozone, and 2.9 for the US. Very slow growth rates. And there's no reason to believe that after the pandemic is put under reasonable control, that they can grow faster than these growth rates. Why? Because all of them have very high per capita incomes already, $40,000 or above. Just for comparison, we have not even reached $4,000 here in the Philippines. So napakataas na kanilang GDP, mahirap to grow at 6 to 7%. And to make matters worse, especially the Eurozone and Japan, they have committed demographic suicide. Wala na silang babies. Their fertility rate is so low and their aging people are so many that they are actually dragging the economy down. Can you just imagine a country where 30% of the population are over 65 and they don't have young people to take care of them? The perfect example is Japan. That's why Japan has not grown over 1 to 2% now for several decades. But take a look at the right. The so-called Asian century countries. The ASEAN, to which we belong, was growing an average of 5.2 before the pandemic. And the Philippines, as you know, was growing above average. We were averaging 6.4% before the pandemic. India was growing at 7.1%. China, 6.6%. All these rates are about 2 to 3 times the American century growth rates. China had slowed down, and China will slow down in the next 5 to 10 years because of what I said. China also committed demographic suicide with their one-child policy that they have been trying to reverse over the last 5 years with no effect. 4 years ago, the Chinese government told the Chinese couples, now you can have 2 instead of 1. No response. Then just last year, they said, you can have 3. No response. That was also the experience of Singapore. Singapore, for 20 years, tried to undo their demographic suicide. Singapore has not succeeded. So that is why the next demographic dividend is what we have after the geographic dividend. I'd like to show you just some other charts. Please, next slide, please. You know, sometime in 2004, just at the beginning of this millennium, an economist from a bank called Goldman Sachs coined the acronym BRIC to stand for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Unfortunately for Brazil and Russia, somewhere along the way, they mismanaged their economies. Now, no one is excited about Brazil and Russia. But India and China remain, and investors have added the ASEAN Economic Community to which we belong. So that's another advantage that we have over the next 5 to 10 years. Investors from all over the world will be focusing on India, China, and the ASEAN. And we better be ready to accept investments from both our own Filipino investors and from foreign investors. That's something that we are still trying to convince our legislators to do. to make the Philippines more attractive by removing so many restrictions against foreign investments. Next, please. Let's say economists that talk about BRIC added what they call the next 11 emerging engines of growth. And take a look at the list. Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Philippines, South Korea, Turkey, and Vietnam. It is notable that only 3 ASEAN countries among 10 were included among these promising emerging engines of growth. To remember those 3, just think of VIP, not very important person, but Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. The 3 largest economies of the ASEAN, very rich in natural resources, and managed well by their respective governments. Vietnam is now the star. It just surpassed the Philippines in GDP per capita last year because it has developed its agriculture much more successfully than we have. It has opened up to more foreign investments, 3 times our foreign investments. And that is why we were left behind. Tayo ng kulela in Southeast Asia, except of course for Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. But compared to our peers, we are now struggling. And the answer is rural and agricultural development. And that's why those of you who are in rural areas and producing all types of products, especially related to food, to agribusiness, are going to help us overcome that #1 weakness of the Philippines, that we are poor in agribusiness. Vietnam 10 years ago was practically not producing coffee because their government was very good in giving their farmers farm-to-market roads, irrigation systems, all the things that they needed to be productive. Vietnam now is the #1 exporter of coffee in the world, having surpassed Brazil. It was a miracle. But definitely it was not a miracle. It was achieved because of good management by their government. Now, fortunately, we have a good Secretary of Agriculture now in William Dar. He's laying the foundation for long-term growth in agricultural productivity, in which many of you who are involved in food production will be involved. Next, please. One of the most prestigious think tanks in the world, Oxford Economics, came out in November 2019, just before the pandemic, with this list. The 10 leading emerging markets that will dominate the global economy the next decade. Surprise, surprise. The Philippines is #2. And I repeat, this is completely independent of any Philippine influence. They made this list on the basis of facts, of what they see. And those facts are the fundamentals I am enumerating for you. So India #1. In fact, India, 5 years from now, will have a population larger than China, because China is already declining in population while India continues to grow. And China is #4 here precisely because of that, because of their aging problem. Next, please. Another British institution called the Center for Economic and Business Research projected the world economy all the way up to 2035. And take a look at what they say about the Philippines. In 2020, we were #32. In 2035, we'll be #22. We will improve 10 ranks, the most improved among these countries, out of 193 countries. So the Philippines, again, is being assessed very positively by an outside think tank. So these are reasons why you, Nanays, can be very optimistic if you take a planning horizon of anywhere from 3 to 5 years and beyond. So don't be depressed because of the difficulties that we will encounter in the next 6 to 12 months. I repeat, we may still see some more virulent version of COVID. And we may have more lockdowns, but go beyond the next 12 months and see all of these that outsiders are saying about our country. Next, please. Again, the professionals among you, the bankers, etc., I'm sure, read a weekly publication also from the UK called The Economist. At the height of the pandemic, this was in May 2020, they listed emerging economies ranked on 4 measures of financial strength. And the Philippines is number 6. Take a look at the countries that we surpassed: Thailand, Saudi Arabia, China, Vietnam, Nigeria, Poland, and so on and so forth. Why do you think The Economist thinks highly of our financial strength? The reason is, as I said, over the last 20 years, the best minds, the best brains were appointed in very important positions in the government, managing our monetary, our fiscal, our macroeconomic sector. And all of these people have contributed to building strong institutions. For example, our central bank is considered one of the best in East Asia. Our governors have been ranked as the best central governors year in and year out, including this present governor. If you take a look at these institutions, at least no matter how you may think of our present president as not the best one that we have elected, he at least has respected the autonomy of his economic managers. Not the Department of Health, but all the economic institutions that count, Central Bank, NEDA, Department of Finance, have been allowed to do their own thing, and they have been doing the right things. For years, our debt to GDP ratio has been kept at 30 to 40%. One of the best in the world. Debt to GDP ratios of Japan, of the US, of Italy can be anywhere from 100 to 150%. We were very responsible, thanks to all of these best minds that had been managing these institutions. That is why when the pandemic broke, we had a lot of elbow room to borrow, because there was no alternative. In order to spend those billions in Bayanihan 1, Bayanihan 2, Bayanihan 3, we had to borrow. And we had the leeway to bring the debt to GDP ratio closer to 70%, which already is dangerous. That is why we will not be able to borrow more once the pandemic is put under control. And that is why we need so much long-term capital from abroad. I keep on telling the government that the next government will be in a very difficult situation because we have reached our borrowing limit. The only way we can continue build to put up more and more businesses is to attract capital from abroad that will be looking for the best places. And as I said, the Philippines is considered one of the best places to bring in capital. Next, please. This is the longest forecast ever made by Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. This was done in 2004 when it was not yet clear that we would graduate from our bad reputation of the sick man of Asia. Nevertheless, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank again saw fundamentals in the Philippine economy. It did not see the Philippines growing at 6 to 7% yet, which happened only from 2011 to 2019. But the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank was very optimistic. Take a look at what the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank said the Philippines would be in 2050. The 16th largest economy in the world, surpassing Indonesia, which would have a population probably 3 times ours, Australia, Argentina, Malaysia, Thailand, Netherlands. That was quite a very positive assessment of our potentials. So this will show you that when I am optimistic about the long term, I am not saying those things because I'm a Filipino. I'm saying these things because outsiders have said good things about us. Next, please. Just before the pandemic, before we started borrowing, which was necessary, the Japan Credit Rating Agency upgraded our credit standing from triple B plus to A minus. Again, the Japanese are very strict in looking at countries because countries from all over the world want to borrow from Japan. And so they must rely on their credit rating agency. That's what they said just before the pandemic. Obviously, today, with our higher debt to GDP ratio, with our higher deficit in our budget, we're no longer A minus, we're back to triple B plus. But we have enough competent people to take over from the present ones in the next administration. And they can manage, once again, the monetary, fiscal, and macroeconomic sectors competently. Next, please. So just to summarize what I have been enumerating, demographic dividend, we have a young, growing, and English-speaking population. You know, our median age is 24. That's one of the lowest in the world. And that gives rise to two of our strongest engines of growth. I mentioned one of them already, our 10 million or more overseas workers. They wouldn't be there if we didn't have a young population. If most of us were over 65, we wouldn't be going abroad. Thanks to our young and growing population, we can afford to supply the world and still have enough for us. I'm not really that worried about the brain drain as long as we improve the quality of education. We will have both for us and for the many countries that are asking for Filipino workers in particular, especially in health and caregiving. I'm sure during the pandemic, you've heard about so many testimonials to our nurses and caregivers from the Queen of England, from the Prime Minister of England, from the Mayor of New York, and so many other leaders from abroad. Geographic dividend, I will explain to you. We are in a region in which people are still willing to trade with one another freely. Unlike some advanced countries, America first, Brexit, they are going against free trade and investment. Here, we have countries that are open to trade, and we should take advantage of that. What is a temporal dividend? That actually should give you also ideas about what businesses to get into. You know, when a family becomes middle class, graduating from low income, it's clear from data over at least the last 2 centuries. In fact, this is called Engel's law. The family will not spend more and more again on kamote, on rice, on the very basic things. They will spend more and more on more sophisticated products. And that is why you, nanays, should think precisely of how middle-class families will graduate from kangkong, from very, very basic things, to the things that some of you are experts, you know, which is sans rival, whether it is all types of dessert that is more sophisticated than just banana Q and so on and so forth. That will be the shift of Filipino families to more sophisticated food products, more sophisticated clothing products, more sophisticated furniture, and that is where you have to be ready to also graduate from very basic things that you're producing to more sophisticated things. We still have a lot of natural resources. In fact, right now, our mining industry is booming thanks to the removal of the restrictions that were imposed in the former administration, because now copper and nickel prices are very high, and we are taking advantage of that. But we still have a lot of room in the area of food exports beyond bananas and pineapples. We can shift our rice farms more and more to avocado, to durian, to coffee, to cacao. That is what was done by Thailand and Vietnam. And some of you are very much involved there. Some of your products eventually will follow the example of the chocolate producers in Davao that are now world class. I see some of you really evolving into producing things that will go beyond the Filipino market. And especially as we recover in tourism, our islands are still among the best in the world. In fact, Palawan was rated the best island resort in the world by a travel and leisure magazine, better than Bali, better than Hawaii. And once in 2025, that's where I see foreign tourism recovering. We will have a lot of foreign tourists here, especially from the Indo-Pacific region. But even before that, domestic tourism will recover, and Nanays, you should be ready for all of your specialties that Filipinos from Manila, from Cebu, from the urban centers will want to buy, in the same way that many of us have been buying ubi jam from the nuns in Baguio. It will not only be Baguio, it will be all over the Philippines where you are located. And there will be 60 million of us, which was the number before the pandemic, traveling from outside our home to Siargao, to Siquijor, to Bohol, to many of these islands. Palawan is, of course, number one. Notice I did not even mention Boracay, which is overrated. We have hundreds of islands that can be better than Boracay. But then, those of you who are there should take advantage of the presence of those domestic tourists to sell to them all sorts of specialty products. Fortunately, our government has continued the Build program that was actually started during the Noy administration. But fortunately, the Duterte administration has kept the percentage of infrastructure at 5 to 6%. It's a very good performance. And that will be continued by at least the next two presidents. Our infrastructure is still so way behind our neighbors. That's why it is a no-brainer. Any president who takes over, we just have to follow the example of President Duterte in spending 6 to 7% of GDP on infrastructure, but with a lot of help from foreigners. And that is why we have to open up our infrastructure sector, especially telecom, for example, and the public utilities. That is where we're now struggling to have our Congress free up this sector. Now, the last thing I'd like to say is the good news over the next 5 to 10 years is that growth will no longer be in Metro Manila. In fact, even before the pandemic, Metro Manila was growing more slowly than Calabarzon, than Davao, than even Bicol, and that will intensify after the pandemic. And you take a look at what is happening now in this area, the movement of residences and industries is towards Calabarzon. You know, if you ask some of the younger married couples where they plan to reside, it's really from Ayala Alabang to New Valley to Santa Rosa to Binyang, all the way up to the Batangas Port. That will be the new Metro Manila in the next 10 years. And that's why those of you who are from Calabarzon are very fortunate. You will have a huge market. And before I forget it, I hope some of you are expanding your Plantito and Plantito projects into real businesses, selling high-value vegetables and fruits that you can get from some technology companies like Harvest, like Eastwo Seeds. You can transform even just 100 square meter of empty lot into a very profitable, high value garden. And your advantage is you are right in the middle of 14 million people in the Calabarzon and Metro Manila area who are your market. And the other expansion of Manila is, and I'm glad to hear that many of you are from there, Central Luzon, especially what is known as the Pampanga Triangle, Angeles, San Fernando, Subic, and Clark. That will be another Metro Manila in no time at all. In fact, if you take a look at the big real estate developers, the Ayalas, the Villars, Mega World, all of them have big projects in Central Luzon. In the Visayas, the most attractive urban area now is Iloilo. Cebu, like Manila, is already congested, traffic and so on and so forth. Iloilo has the best infrastructure now in the Visayas area. And especially once they finish the bridge between Iloilo to Guimaras to Bacolod, that will be a huge metropolis. And at the same time, still with a lot of touristic attractions. As you know, Guimaras is a touristic island. In Mindanao, it's a no-brainer. It's Davao that's growing very fast. And real estate development there is matching almost the rate of Manila. Some real estate prices in Davao are almost like the prices of Manila. So I think I've said enough, and I'm sure some of you will have questions. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bernie Villegas. You
Yes.
know, your optimism is really encouraging, especially at this time. And then, I read an article, your article in the business world, wherein actually it's called the enduring humanity of work. And then your article mentioned about we must devote our attention to investing in the human capital of the less privileged members of the society. Ang sabi nga ni Dr. Villegas, para sa mga nanay ito, in today's knowledge economy, ang new asset class para sa productivity growth will be the human capital. Your talent, skills, creativity, and that's what Dr. Bernie Villegas mentioned earlier. Marami kayo niyan, mga nanay and micro-entrepreneurs. Kaya improve pa natin ang mga sarili natin. Kagaya ng mga sinabi ni Dr. kanina, Dr. Bernie, na yung mga produkto natin, wag lang tayong titigil doon. Wag tayong susuko. And then, surely, sabi nga ni Joey, we will be in the global supply chain also. Thank you, Dr. Bernie. But before this, before I go to the next part of the program, some questions came in. And then we might be able to, Dr. Bernie might be able to answer them. But if there is time constraint, then we will answer them on our Facebook page. Let's call on Joey to be the moderator for the questions and answer.
Thank you, Joe. Dr. Bernie, the first question that came in was from Rizal Raul Reyes of the Business Mirror. He's asking, what is the role of digitization in all of this development efforts?
Well, obviously, the sector that did not suffer from the pandemic, but actually benefited from it, was the digital sector. So just imagine all the education online, most of the purchases are online. And now here you have your Iskaparate.com. So definitely the whole area of digitalization has benefited a lot. It has actually grown in 6 months what it could have taken 3 years without the pandemic. And that is why I'm so glad that Iskaparate is making the nanays already part of this sector. Whether you know it or not, you're already part of Industrial Revolution 4.0. because you are actually already using the digital technology to improve your business. So, but we have to keep on learning new things. So that is part of skills development. Nanays have to be as upskilled, have to be reskilled, have to be retooled in the area of digitalization. And you can count on Iskaparate.com to help you in that process. So remember, learning should never end. Education is a lifetime process. And fortunately, there are groups like Iskaparate that are going to enable you to learn as long as you want.
Thank you, Dr. Bernie. There is a question from Jose Rene Gallo who asks, what do you think about farm tourism? Where does it come in the entire development agenda?
Oh, definitely. It's very much part. And in fact, the Secretary of Tourism herself, Bernadette Romulo Puyat, is giving a lot of emphasis to agritourism. People precisely from urban areas like us, when they go outside of Metro Manila, they enjoy taking a look at what they never see here. You know, I always remember one of our students, and probably Rene will remember it in CRC. When we went out on excursion, he was looking for where the peanuts were growing on trees. No, yeah, he thought peanuts grew on trees, and there are millions of people from Dasmariñas, from Forbes, etc., that don't even know how some of these products are grown. No? And so agritourism is definitely something that we should focus on, and especially if you are able to intersperse your vegetables and fruits with the beautiful flowers that we can grow in many places of the Philippines, like in Tagaytay. And I was just in Silang Cavite, and since I'm a plantito, I was so glad to be able to buy. Right now, the zinnias are in bloom, and there's so many colors now of the zinnias that are already ready there for planting. You just bring it to your home, and you have a nice garden.
Thank you, Dr. Bernie. A question from Santi Dumlao. The
Santi.
aggregates look good, but how do you reduce income inequality?
Well, that's exactly what Mayani is doing. You should have more projects like Iskaparate, Mayani, and so on and so forth that address specifically the needs of the poor. I'm so glad that now the phrase ESG is being used by all companies, whether big or small, meaning whether or not they are social enterprise. And clearly, Iskaparate and Mayani are social enterprises. They are for profit, but they want to address a specific social problem, and that is poverty. But many other companies, whether it's San Miguel, whether it's the Ayalas, and so on and so forth, are building in what is known as the ESG concept to do something either for the environment, environmental sustainability, that's E, for social problem, like addressing poverty or improving the quality of education, for example, like the Ayalas, no? And finally, governance. Now, that is really more difficult thing, how to eradicate corruption. And we're seeing that right now. My only consolation, and I hope I'm not misunderstood here, is one can be a first world country like South Korea without completely eradicating corruption. I'm sure those of us who watch these Korean telenovelas know that there is still so much corruption today in South Korea, both in the government and in the private sector, which more or less shows that even if we don't succeed in our effort to eradicate corruption, as long as we have the right economic policies, institutions that are independent of the politicians, we can become first world like South Korea.
Thank you, Dr. Bernie. A question from Joel Valdez. Where are we going to get the money, given the deficits, to pay for the development that we're hoping would transpire post-pandemic?
That's why I'm saying those of us who are in the know are fighting with all our might to convince, first of all, those three measures: public utility, retail trade rationalization, and there's a Foreign Investment Act. They can be passed even without revising the Constitution. And I think they can be passed. They're very close to being passed. So that can open up more of the public utilities sectors to foreign investments. And there are really a lot of foreigners, the Japanese, the Koreans, etc., know that they have a limit to what they can invest in their respective economies. But they're accumulating capital. And they see Southeast Asia as the best area. And now most of them are just going to Vietnam. But if we don't change our policies, that will continue. So that's the first. And in the next government, I will continue my advocacy for removing from the Constitution, and without false modesty, I must say that I was part of writing the Constitution, and I knew very well how people during our generation were still so ultra-nationalistic. I don't want to be considered a hero, but I was one of the few who were saying we have to open up to foreign investments. But practically all of them, rightists, leftists, whatever they were also saying Filipino first. And that is no longer an ideology that will help the poor. Filipino first only helps the richest Filipinos to control the economy and done to the rest of us. That is what Filipino first has done in this country.
Thank you, Dr. Villegas. There are a lot more questions, but you expect that every time Dr. Bernie speaks, the questions just flood you. But we will just ask one more question. The others will probably answer to our Facebook page. We will ask Dr. Bernie to answer them. But the last question came from 3 listeners. They ask about the demographic sweet spot that you were referring to. Are we squandering this demographic dividend, and how much more runway do we have for this?
Well, the first problem we have to solve is to improve the quality of education, to address that very well-known fact that our pupils do very poorly in international tests. But I'm glad to see that there are a lot of people in the business sector are doing what Joey is doing in this area. There's a Philippine Business for Education, top executives really helping the government to address this problem of this low quality of especially our public education. So that's one way that we will not squander these young people. And going back to food, I'm part of a foundation started by some executives called the Philippine Food Bank Foundation that has convinced a good number of very large food companies like Central Pacific, Alaska, and others, San Miguel, and to get their soon-to-expire products to our foundation, which we now distribute to especially hungry children. I specify children because the quality of education is very related to the way children are able to eat the necessary nutrition when they're young. Because if they do not have the right nutrition when they're young, their brains are already permanently damaged. And that explains part of the reason why they cannot have good education when they go to the elementary schools. So we have to address that. And that's why anything that can be done by the private sector to address the quality of food of children, especially of the poor, will also redound to the improvement of quality education.
Thank you, Dr. Bernie. We will email you the rest of the questions that came in.
Yes.
And hope that you can answer them so we can publish them for everyone's consumption. But before I turn over the floor back to our MC, I'd like to relay a message from 3 of the nanays who sent in messages saying thank you for giving them hope. So salamat, Dr. Bernie. And
yes.
I turn it over back to Joe.
Okay. Thank you, Joey, and thank you, Dr. Bernie.